Picture the moment. An Ilyushin 76 cargo aircraft descends through the haze above the Lebanese coast, its engines cutting through the silence of a country that has spent weeks buried under rubble and grief. Israeli radar tracks it. Israeli commanders know exactly what it is, where it came from, and who sent it, and they do absolutely nothing because there is nothing they can do. That aircraft, bearing Russian markings and carrying orders signed personally by Vladimir Putin, lands at Beirut's international airport without a single shot fired, without a diplomatic intervention capable of stopping it, without even a phone call from Washington that changes the outcome. 27 tons of supplies touch Lebanese soil, and in that moment something shifts, not just on the ground in Lebanon, but across the entire strategic architecture of the Middle East. A message has been delivered, and it has nothing to do with the cargo in the hold. This is not a story the Western press knows how to tell cleanly, because it does not fit neatly into the narratives that have been constructed around this conflict. Russia is supposed to be isolated. Russia is supposed to be bleeding in Ukraine, crippled by sanctions, cut off from the world. And yet here is a Russian government aircraft landing in one of the most contested corridors on the planet, doing something that neither the European Union, nor the Arab League, nor the United States chose to do first. That tension between the story being told and the reality unfolding is exactly where the truth of this situation lives. To understand the full weight of what happened on April 20th, you need to understand what Lebanon has been living through in the weeks before that aircraft arrived. The ground operation that Israel intensified in early March pushed into the south with a ferocity that drew international condemnation in statements and almost nothing in practice. By the middle of April, Lebanese health authorities, figures corroborated by United Nations agencies operating inside the country, had recorded more than 2,200 dead and approximately 7,500 wounded. These are not casualty figures from a brief skirmish. These are the numbers of a sustained, grinding campaign of destruction that has hollowed out entire communities in the south and sent waves of displacement into an already fragile country. The infrastructure damage compounds everything. Electrical grids knocked out, water systems compromised, hospitals running on generators when they are running at all, and into that darkness, quite literally, Russia sent generators. Let that sit for a moment because it is not a minor detail. The deliberate targeting of civilian electrical infrastructure is not a gray area under international humanitarian law. The laws of war are explicit. Power plants, water treatment facilities, the basic physical systems that keep civilian populations alive, these are protected categories. Destroying them intentionally is a war crime. When a military campaign systematically dismantles these systems, and when the international community that claims to uphold the laws of war provides diplomatic cover for that campaign while condemning others for lesser violations, the credibility of the entire framework collapses. Russia identified that collapse and walked straight through the opening it created. Now here is where the analysis requires some intellectual honesty, because this story is easy to misread in two opposite directions. The first misreading is to treat the Russian flight as pure altruism, as evidence that Moscow has reinvented itself as a guardian of humanitarian principles. That reading is naive to the point of being dangerous. Russia's interests in the Middle East are strategic, calculated, and pursued with a consistency that reflects long-term planning rather than spontaneous compassion. The second misreading is to dismiss the flight entirely as cynical propaganda, to say that because Russia's motives are self-interested, the act itself carries no meaning. That reading ignores something fundamental about how power actually works in international relations. The truth sits between those two errors. Russia delivered aid to Lebanon because doing so advances Russian interests. It builds influence in a country that sits at the intersection of Iranian, Israeli, and American strategic priorities. It demonstrates operational capacity and political will in a region where the United States has spent years allowing its own credibility to erode. And crucially, it demonstrates that the informal Western consensus about which countries get to receive material support and which do not, that consensus can be broken. That demonstration has a value that extends far beyond Lebanon, far beyond this particular conflict, and far beyond this particular moment. Consider what Russia has built across this region over the past several years, not through military conquest in the traditional sense, but through the far more durable instrument of showing up when others did not. Its influence in Iran predates the current escalation and has deepened as Western pressure on Tehran intensified. Its presence in Iraq persists despite enormous American investment in that country over 2 decades. It has cultivated relationships in Oman, positioned itself carefully in Syria, and now it is establishing a foothold in Lebanon at the precise moment when Lebanese society is most desperate for external support and most aware of which powers chose to provide it. None of this happened by accident. It is the result of a strategy that understands something American foreign policy has repeatedly failed to grasp, that the relationships built during crises are the relationships that last. The United States, meanwhile, is navigating this moment with a combination of financial commitment and diplomatic incoherence that has produced the worst of both worlds. The financial commitment is real and substantial. American military and political support for Israeli operations is not a minor footnote. It is a defining feature of the current conflict, one that makes American claims of impartial concern for Lebanese civilian welfare extremely difficult to sustain, and the diplomatic incoherence reaches its most striking expression in the question of who exactly is supposed to be mediating this conflict on the American side. Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, holds the Middle East portfolio in the current administration. The appointment itself would be remarkable in any administration, given that it places an individual with no professional diplomatic background, no career foreign service experience, and no specialized academic preparation for the role into one of the most complex and consequential diplomatic assignments on earth. But the more fundamental problem is not his resume. It is his relationships. Documented, publicly acknowledged, described with evident pride in the Jewish press and reported by major American newspapers, is the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu has maintained a close personal friendship with the Kushner family for decades. Netanyahu reportedly slept in Jared Kushner's childhood bedroom during visits to the United States. The gesture is described in these accounts as a mark of honor, a sign of the depth of the relationship. From a diplomatic standpoint, it is something else entirely. You cannot be a neutral mediator when you have a documented personal friendship with one of the primary parties to the conflict. This is not a partisan observation. It is not a statement about religion, ethnicity, or cultural background. The religion of the mediator is entirely beside the point. What is relevant, analytically and institutionally, is the structure of relationships, the financial connections, and the documented alignment of personal loyalties. A mediator with those relationships in place is not mediating. He is managing the optics of a predetermined position, and the parties who are supposed to be on the other side of that mediation know it. The Lebanese government knows it, the Iranian government knows it, and Vladimir Putin has known it from the beginning. This structural failure in American diplomacy has consequences that extend far beyond any single conflict. When the credibility of American mediation collapses, as it has collapsed across most of the non-Western world, the vacuum does not remain empty. Other powers step into it. Russia steps into it. China has stepped into it in other contexts. And they do so not necessarily because their own diplomatic conduct is above reproach, but because the gap between American rhetoric and American practice has become so visible, so consistently documented, and so damaging to the populations that bear the consequences of that gap, that alternatives gain appeal almost by default. There is a longer historical pattern worth examining here. The American model of influence in the Middle East has traditionally operated through a combination of security guarantees, economic relationships, and what might be called the management of access. Which countries are integrated into the international financial system and which are not? Which countries face import restrictions and which do not? Which populations receive emergency assistance when crises strike, and which are left to negotiate bureaucratic labyrinths while their hospitals run out of medicine? This system of managed access served American strategic interests for decades with considerable effectiveness, but its effectiveness depended on a perception of American legitimacy that has been spent down, crisis by crisis, conflict by conflict, over the past quarter century. The Ilyushin 76 that landed in Beirut is, in miniature, a monument to that spending down. A Russian aircraft, in a region where Russian influence was once marginal compared to American dominance, lands without interference, delivers supplies that a population desperately needs, and departs. The cameras captured it. The Lebanese people witnessed it. And governments across the region drew their own conclusions about which powers were present at the moment it mattered and which were absent. None of this is to suggest that the trajectory is fixed or that American influence in the Middle East is irreparably lost. Trajectories can be reversed. Credibility can be rebuilt, though never as quickly as it is lost. The tools for doing so are not mysterious. Consistent application of the principles that American foreign policy claims to represent. Appointments of mediators who are structurally capable of genuine neutrality rather than the performance of it. A willingness to hold allies to the same standards that are applied to adversaries, particularly when those allies are destroying civilian infrastructure in ways that the laws of war prohibit, regardless of the justification offered. These are not radical propositions. They are the baseline requirements of a foreign policy that can sustain its own stated values under scrutiny. But the window for applying those tools is not unlimited. Every flight like the one that landed in Beirut narrows it slightly. Every generator that restores power to a neighborhood that American-funded operations plunged into darkness makes the gap between what America says and what America does a little more visible to a little wider audience. And visibility in international relations has a way of hardening into conviction, and conviction into alignment, and alignment into a new map of regional influence that will take decades to redraw. The aircraft has landed, the supplies have been delivered, and the question that remains, the one that will define the next chapter of Middle Eastern geopolitics, is whether the powers that claim to lead the international order will reckon honestly with what that landing revealed, or whether they will continue constructing explanations that protect the narrative while the underlying reality continues shifting beneath their feet.